I'm 44 now, the kind of guy who owns a toolbox he actually uses and a back that complains if I sneeze wrong. I live in a narrow row house outside the city, the kind with squeaky stairs and old plaster that never stops shedding dust. Most nights I'm boring on purpose. Dinner, laundry, a couple emails, bed. I've built my life around quiet. Like if I keep everything steady enough, nothing can slip out from under me again. But there's a spot in my living room ceiling where the paint has bubbled for years, right above the couch. I used to stare at it during insomnia, tracing the crack like a map, thinking about all the things I never fixed. Some people have old photos in frames. I had that stupid blister of paint, a reminder that time doesn't heal anything. You just get better at stepping over it. What I'm about to tell you starts with me finally dragging the ladder out last month and cutting into that ceiling. It ends with a packet of company shares. Paper, not digital, hidden up there like someone's last secret. Shares that, according to a lawyer who went pale when he saw the name, are now worth more money than I can even picture without feeling nauseous. And the worst part? The name on the packet wasn't mine. It was his. The person I haven't said out loud in 25 years. I was 19 when I met Merrick. That's the first thing that still feels unfair. How someone can be so important to your life and then become a word you avoid like a curse. We were both broke in the same way, living on instant noodles and cheap cigarettes, pretending it was temporary because we were hungry and driven. Not just poor. He was the smart one, the kind of kid who could take apart a radio and put it back together while talking about stocks like they were sports. I was the fixer, good with my hands, good at people, good at making things look possible. We rented a damp little room behind a mechanic's shop and spent nights helping this older guy build software for small factories. It wasn't glamorous. It was cables and coffee and the smell of oil bleeding through the walls. Then the older guy offered us something that sounded fake. A tiny packet of shares as thanks, because he couldn't pay real wages. Merrick lit up like someone had handed him a winning lottery ticket. I laughed and told him paper doesn't buy groceries. He told me I was stupid and proud, and he wasn't wrong. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. That's what haunts me. It was just one night, a slammed door, and a stupid choice I made because I wanted to feel in control. Merrick had the packet in his backpack. I took it, not to sell, God no, but to prove a point, to make him admit we were being played. He walked in, saw the open zipper, and his face. It still shows up in my dreams, like I'd reached into his chest and pulled something out. The fallout was immediate and ugly. Merrick didn't yell at first, which somehow made it worse. He just stood there, hands shaking, asking me why over and over, like maybe the answer would change. I kept insisting I was holding on to it temporarily, that I wanted leverage, proof, something. The words sounded thin even to me. By morning, he'd packed his stuff into a trash bag and left the room without another glance. What I didn't expect was how fast the story twisted once it left that room. The older guy accused both of us of stealing, but Marek's name stuck to it harder. I had the shares, but Merrick had the reputation for numbers, ambition, greed. People believed the version where he'd planned it. I didn't correct them. I told myself it was complicated, that I'd explain it later, that things would cool down. They never did. Within weeks, the job vanished, the room was gone, and so was Merrick. He dropped out, moved cities, erased himself. Mutual friends stopped calling me, not angrily, just quietly, like I'd developed a smell no one wanted on them. I kept the packet locked in a drawer, untouched, telling myself I'd return it once he reached out. He never did. I went on with my life carrying something that wasn't mine, watching doors close without ever hearing them slam. The worst consequence wasn't losing him. It was realizing I'd chosen pride over clarity, and then hidden behind the mess I helped create. Decades passed in the quietest way possible. No dramatic fallout, no late-night apologies, no cinematic reunion. Just years stacking on top of each other like dust. I moved apartments, changed jobs, learned how to be someone people could rely on without ever asking too much of me. I became solid, dependable, the kind of guy you call when your sink leaks, not when your life falls apart. The packet of shares followed me like a ghost. Always hidden, always unopened. First in a drawer, then a lockbox, then sealed in plastic when I started worrying about fires and floods. I told myself I was safeguarding it. That one day Merrick would resurface, older and calmer, and I'd hand it back like returning a borrowed book. But years went by without a single trace of him. No social media, no mutual friends, nothing. Sometimes I'd hear his name in my head when I saw headlines about startups or sudden billionaires, and I'd feel this tight, irrational panic. Other times, late at night, I'd convince myself the shares were worthless anyway, that I'd ruin my friendship over paper that meant nothing. That version was easier to live with. Still, regret has a way of aging with you. It doesn't fade. It matures. It becomes quieter, heavier, and harder to explain. By 40, I'd accepted that some things don't get resolved. They just get carried. Last month, the ceiling finally forced my hand. A slow brown stain spread outward like a bruise, and one night a soft crack woke me up. I stood there in the dark, staring up, realizing that if I didn't deal with it now, it would deal with me later. So on a gray Saturday morning, I dragged out the ladder, laid plastic over the couch, and started cutting into plaster that had been there longer than I had. Dust rained down, thick and sour-smelling. My arms ached, sweat ran into my eyes, and for a while it was just manual work, comforting in that mindless way. Then my saw hit something that wasn't wood. Not a beam, not wiring, something hollow. I widened the hole with shaking hands and reached inside. My fingers brushed against brittle paper wrapped in yellowed plastic. When I pulled it out, a folded packet slipped free and landed on the floor with a sound that felt too loud. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. My chest went tight before my brain caught up. The label was faded but legible. The company name, the old logo, and beneath it, written in pen I recognized instantly, the name I hadn't said in 25 years. Merrick. I sat there on the floor, plaster dust in my hair, holding something that should never have been above my ceiling. Something I was never meant to find like this. For a long time, I couldn't stand up. I just sat there on the floor, back against the couch, staring at the packet like it might start breathing. My hands were numb, not metaphorically, actually tingling like I'd cut circulation. I kept expecting the room to tilt, or my heart to do something dramatic, but instead everything went eerily flat, quiet. Even the street noise outside felt muted. My first thought was stupid and small. This can't be real. My second was worse. I hid it there. At some point, sometime after Merrick left, when I was still raw and angry and convinced I was right, I'd shoved it up into the ceiling like if I couldn't see it, it couldn't accuse me. I had no memory of doing it, just the sick certainty that it had been me. I opened the packet with shaking fingers. The paper inside was intact, crisp in a way that felt mocking. Dates, signatures, everything official. I grabbed my phone, hands slick with sweat, and searched the company name. The result came back instantly. Acquired. Global. Valuation numbers so big my brain refused to process them. I felt dizzy, like I was standing too close to the edge of something high. Shock isn't loud like movies make it seem. It's isolating. It's realizing that one stupid, pride-filled night at 19 had been quietly compounding interest for decades, waiting above my ceiling while I slept underneath it, pretending the past was sealed shut. I didn't tell anyone for 3 days. Not my sister, not my coworkers, not even the friend I usually text stupid memes to at midnight. I walked around with this weight in my chest, like I was carrying contraband inside my ribs. On the 4th day, I called a lawyer I barely knew, recommended by a guy who owed me a favor. I brought the packet in a plain grocery bag, like I was ashamed of it. He went quiet as he flipped through the papers. Not the polite quiet of someone concentrating, the other kind. The kind where the room seems to shrink. He asked where I got them. I told him the truth, or at least my version of it, stumbling through names and years and pauses that stretched too long. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "Do you have any idea what this is worth?" I shook my head. He gave me a number that felt fictional. Then he said Marek's name out loud, careful, like it might break. He'd found records, corporate filings, a brief bio. Merrick hadn't disappeared. He'd moved, kept working, stayed connected to the company long enough to be listed as an early contributor who withdrew under disputed circumstances. That phrase stuck in my throat. Before I left, the lawyer asked a question that made my stomach drop. "Have you spoken to him since?" I said no. He nodded slowly and said, "You should, because if these are his and you've had them all this time, this isn't just money. This is a reckoning." The reveal didn't come from a dramatic meeting or a screaming phone call. It came from something folded inside the packet that I'd missed the first time because my hands were shaking too hard. Tucked behind the certificates was a thin envelope, brittle with age, my address written on it in that same precise handwriting. It had never been sealed, just waiting. The letter was dated 8 years after Merrick left. He wrote about coming back to the city once, about standing across the street from my place and watching my lights turn on at night. He said the company was finally taking off, and lawyers were circling like sharks. Someone was accusing him of stealing early shares. My version of the story turned official. He knew they'd come after him, maybe freeze assets, maybe take everything. So he did the one thing I never expected. He trusted me. He wrote that he'd hidden the shares above my ceiling because it was the safest place he knew. Because despite everything, I was still the guy who fixed things, who held onto stuff too tightly, who wouldn't burn it all down out of spite. He said he didn't know if I'd ever find them. He said he forgave me anyway. I had to read that sentence 3 times. The shares weren't stolen. They weren't forgotten. They were left with me on purpose. Not as punishment, as faith. And realizing that broke something open in my chest I'd spent decades armoring shut. That truth rewired everything. All those years I'd carried this quiet shame, imagining Merrick as a ghost I'd wronged beyond repair, and meanwhile he'd been alive, building something massive, still thinking of me as a safe place. It made my careful, modest life feel suddenly lopsided, like I'd been living under a low ceiling without realizing it was false. I started replaying my past with new subtitles. The lawyer's phrase, "withdrew under disputed circumstances," wasn't an indictment. It was Merrick stepping away to avoid dragging me into a fight I wasn't equipped for. All the rumors, the cold shoulders, the way people drifted away from me. He'd absorbed the worst of it and kept moving. I'd stayed behind, nursing guilt that was only half-earned. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like responsibility catching up. Every choice I'd made to stay small, to avoid ambition, suddenly looked less like humility and more like penance. I'd built a life around not deserving too much, and now I was holding proof that someone I hurt had believed I deserved everything. I couldn't unsee it. At work, during conversations, even fixing the ceiling I'd cut open, there was this low hum under everything. You were trusted. That kind of truth doesn't let you sleep. It demands something back, and I didn't yet know what shape that repayment was supposed to take. The conflict hit me in the ugliest way possible. In my own head, at 3 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter spread out like evidence. One voice kept saying the shares were legally mine now, abandoned property, found inside my house. Another voice, quieter, sharper, kept repeating Marek's handwriting, the way he'd spelled my name wrong once and never fixed it. I got angry at him, which felt obscene. Angry for forgiving me without asking. Angry for trusting me after I'd already proven I could fail him. Angry for leaving this decision in my lap like a delayed explosion. I slammed my fist on the table hard enough to rattle the mug, then immediately felt stupid and alone. I tried imagining the confrontation that would never happen. Me tracking him down, him rich and untouchable. Me confessing that I'd lived beneath his ceiling for years without knowing. In some versions, he laughed. In others, he walked away. None of them gave me peace. The worst part was realizing there was no version where I could keep the money and still recognize myself. It didn't matter what the law said. I'd spent 25 years defining myself by what I could live with. And suddenly the old answer, not much, wasn't good enough anymore. I finally found him through a chain of polite emails and one very awkward phone call. He didn't sound surprised when I said my name. Tired, maybe. Older. Like someone who'd been carrying weight in a different way. We met in a quiet cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and money, the kind with no prices on the wall. He wore the same neutral colors he always had, just tailored now. He let me talk first. I stumbled through the ceiling, the packet, the letter. My voice cracked when I admitted I'd taken the shares back then. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "I know. Not cruel. Not smug. Just factual." He told me he'd figured it out years ago. That night had hurt. But what hurt more was how quickly everything turned into a story he couldn't control. He said he hid the shares because if they stayed with him, they'd be used as leverage by people who didn't care who got crushed. "You were the only variable I trusted," he said. "Not because you were perfect, because you weren't." He explained that forgiving me wasn't generosity. It was survival. Carrying anger, he said, would have cost him more than the money ever could. Hearing that didn't absolve me, complicated everything, and somehow that felt closer to the truth than punishment ever had. The climax wasn't loud. There was no yelling, no dramatic exit. It happened when I slid the packet across the small cafe table toward him and felt my hands finally stop shaking. I told him I hadn't touched a cent, hadn't even opened the ceiling until the house forced me to, that I'd spent half my life punishing myself for a crime that apparently ended differently than I thought. He stared at the packet for a long time without touching it. Then he pushed it back toward me. "I don't want it," he said. "That broke me. Not metaphorically." I started crying right there. The ugly kind where your face twists and you can't breathe right. People glanced over, then away. He didn't. He just waited. When I could talk again, I asked him why. Why trust me then? Why now? He said the shares had already done their job. They kept him safe when it mattered. Now they were just symbols. "But you," he said quietly, "you're still living like it's 1999. I told him I didn't know how to be anything else. He leaned forward and said, "Then let this be the moment. Not forgiveness, not repayment, just change." It felt like standing on the edge of something terrifying and realizing the fall was optional. I spent a week barely sleeping, walking through my days like I was underwater. In the end, the decision wasn't as complicated as I'd tried to make it. I transferred the shares into a trust under Marek's name, with conditions he couldn't refuse without at least acknowledging it. Legal, clean, boring. The opposite of how our story started. Then I did something harder. Quit my job. Not dramatically, just handed in notice and packed my desk. I realized how much of my life had been built around staying safe, staying small, staying undeserving. Marek didn't ask me to change. That made it worse. That made it necessary. We met one last time before he flew out. No speeches, no hugs, just a long, awkward pause outside his hotel. I apologized again, quieter this time, not trying to earn anything. He nodded and said, "I know," like it finally meant something different. I went home and fixed the ceiling properly. New beams, fresh plaster, clean paint. No hidden compartments, no secrets. When I put the couch back, the room felt taller, like it could finally hold the air. Resolution isn't closure. It's choosing not to reopen the wound every day. I didn't erase the past. I just stopped letting it decide how much space I was allowed to take up in my own life. The outcome wasn't instant wealth or some movie version reinvention. It was quieter, steadier, and somehow heavier. Without the job, my days opened up in a way that scared me. I started taking contracts I would have said no to before. Saying yes felt reckless at first, then honest. I fixed houses for people who actually watched and listened, not just hovered. I charged what the work was worth and didn't apologize for it. Marek didn't disappear again, but we didn't become friends either. We send the occasional email. Sparse, polite, real. I know where he is now, and that knowledge doesn't hurt anymore. The trust paperwork went through, and I never checked the numbers after that. I didn't need to. The money was never the point once the truth surfaced. What changed most was how I carried myself. I stopped flinching when good things happened, stopped assuming there was a hidden bill coming due. Friends noticed before I did. They said I seemed taller, calmer, like I'd finally put something down I'd been hauling around for years. Sometimes I sit on the couch and look up at the smooth ceiling, remembering what used to be hidden there. It doesn't feel haunted now. It feels earned, like a scar that's finally healed over enough to touch without pain, reminding me that survival and self-respect don't have to be opposites. I think about that ceiling more than I should. Not the money, Not the shares, not the impossible numbers that still make my stomach flip if I dwell on them. I think about how easily a life can be shaped by what you hide instead of what you face. For years, I told myself time had done the work for me, that distance counted as growth. It doesn't. Time just gives your mistakes more room to echo. What I learned, late, expensively, and with a lot of quiet damage, is that betrayal isn't always the loud moment. Sometimes it's the silence afterward. The story you let other people believe because correcting it would cost you comfort. I lived inside that silence for half my life, mistaking endurance for integrity. Merrick trusted me when I didn't deserve it, and somehow that trust outlived my failure. That's the part one still struggle with. Not everyone gets that kind of second draft. Not everyone gets a literal ceiling hiding proof that the past isn't finished with you yet. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Unfinished things don't stay buried. They wait. And when they surface, you don't get to choose whether to deal with them, only who you'll be when you do. I spent years repairing other people's damage because it felt safer than opening my own walls. Turns out, the real repair wasn't finding something priceless overhead. It was finally standing upright underneath it, willing to take responsibility for the weight, and deciding not to live crouched anymore.